Video contains violent content, details that are not suitable for common perception. Please consider before watching. Chapter 240, Primordial True Chi 3. Whoosh. Mok Jae-eun slowly stood up as a hazy smoke billowed out. Commander Seo Yeon's pupils trembled as she looked at him. He's pushing out the primordial true chi that had penetrated his vital points. Primordial true chi was the source energy itself, so once it penetrated the body, it was difficult to expel it externally unless one possessed stronger internal power. However, the ferocious energy currently rising from Mok Jae-eun was surprisingly pushing out the primordial true chi. What on earth is this energy? The smoke was gradually turning into black haze. The energy was difficult to describe, feeling both turbid and even evil. At this, wariness filled her eyes. Even after having his 8 vital points struck and adjusting his power to utilize such energy, this person, he has crossed the wall. Seo Yeon was convinced at once that Mok Jae-eun had crossed the wall. From the moment he had crumbled the Geok stone in the first test, she had estimated that he had reached the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm or possibly even higher, which was quite astonishing. How could someone not even in his early 20s have reached such a realm? I heard he was a disciple of the Shadow Clan master of the Heaven and Earth Society. If the information she had heard in advance was correct, that was the case. However, even the Shadow Clan master of the Heaven and Earth Society hadn't reached this level of realm. Explaining this as simply the student surpassing the teacher seemed insufficient. Everything about this person from his energy to all aspects felt dangerous. Let's subdue him for now. Anyway, the bastard had tried to kill Ju Wunhyang. Then there was no need to show mercy. Pot. Commander Seo Yeon kicked off the ground and leaped towards Mok Jae-eun. Her figure blurred and disappeared in an instant. At that moment, Mok Jae-eun's right eye flashed. Along with it, Mok Jae-eun utilized Na Yelrang, the great master of the Heaven and Earth Society's bright water crossing step, and moved his body with ultra-high-speed movement. Smack. The moment Mok Jae-eun moved, a hand abruptly emerged where he had been standing. It was none other than Seo Yeon's hand. He dodged it. Seo Yeon's delicate eyebrows raised upwards. Considering that the opponent was an expert who had crossed the wall, she had increased her speed to match that level. Yet he had avoided it. Moreover, his movement was extraordinary. Ultra-high-speed movement? Her eyes shifted to the right. There, Mok Jae-eun, who had dodged her attack, was thrusting his fingers infused with black energy towards her to launch a counterattack. Strong energy? Judging from the momentum, it was definitely strong energy. But how could strong energy contain such a ferocious energy? She felt the primordial true chi within her body strongly rejecting it. It's not something to block with ordinary strong energy. At this, Huang. She concentrated her primordial true chi and created strong energy with a white light in her hand. With the strong energy formed, Seo Yeon thrust her fingers towards Mok Jae-eun's wrist as he was stabbing towards her head. Quick response. At this, Mok Jae-eun hurriedly stopped his thrust and changed direction using his footwork. Bam. And he kicked upwards with his leg towards her chin. Smack. However, Mok Jae-eun's kick brushed through the air. She had twisted her body to the side in an instant. Not stopping there, Seo Yeon dug closer to Mok Jae-eun and swiftly placed her palm on his abdomen. Bang! At that moment, a rippling shockwave occurred from the point of impact. It was the issuing of strength. The energy infused with primordial true chi would penetrate his body and dig into his 5 viscera and 6 bowels. Or so she thought. Bam! At that moment, her palm, which had been issuing the strength, was repelled. Puzzled about what this was, she soon couldn't hide her astonishment. That was because she discovered that Mok Jae-eun had placed his palm towards her back. This fellow. He had blocked the issuing of strength with another issuing of strength. It was an unbelievable level of judgment. How could he use the issuing of strength towards her back in this fleeting moment? This wasn't something that came from long experience. It could be said that his combat sense itself was very innate. However, an opening. Thud. She had more experience than she appeared. Therefore, she didn't miss the opening that appeared in Mok Jae-eun the moment he blocked the blow with a reverse issuing of strength, and she struck a palm strike at his chin. Mok Jae-eun's body, hit by this, floated in the air with a whoosh and flew 8 feet back before falling. Having been hit on the chin, the impact to his brain prevented Mok Jae-eun from immediately standing up due to dizziness. Strong. Mok Jeongun clicked his tongue inwardly. Among those he had encountered so far, excluding that mysterious old man and the Heaven and Earth sect leader, she was undoubtedly the highest level. Moreover, he couldn't even gauge the extent of her skills. Mortal. This wench is not using her full strength. I know. Mok Jeongun agreed with Chong Ryong's words. Unlike himself, who was using his full power by releasing even the demonic chi he had been hiding, she wasn't drawing upon all her energy. In his right eye, which had unleashed the power of the third eye, he could see her striving to suppress her energy. If all of that were to be released, he couldn't even estimate the level it would reach. Cough cough. Commander. At that moment, Ju Wunhyang called out to Commander Seo Yeren. Due to being hit in the Adam's apple by Mok Jeongun and suffering internal injuries, his voice didn't come out loudly, but there was no way an expert of her caliber wouldn't hear it. Seo Yeren turned her head and said, Ju Wunhyang. Your internal injuries are severe, so first focus on circulating your energy and breathing. Hurry. At her words, Ju Wunhyang shook his head. This was to dissuade her for the moment. Regardless of the process, Mok Jeongun had ultimately given up on harming him. Therefore he wanted to explain the situation, but, Commander. First stop. Before he could even finish his words, Seo Yeren extended her hand and turned her head. That was because Mok Jeongun had already stood up again. You're strong, Commander. As Mok Jeongun spoke, Seo Yeren clicked her tongue. Even though she had adjusted her strength, she thought the palm strike she had sent to his chin would eventually make him lose consciousness due to the impact on his brain. However, Mok Jeongun looked unscathed. Judging from this, his recovery ability seemed to be much faster than ordinary people. As expected, he's a dangerous person. It was a dilemma. She had intended to stop at a moderate level of subduing him. However, it might be better to handle it properly after all. At that moment, Ju Wunhyang hurriedly took steps towards her and tried to shout. Commander. First listen to me. Cough. At that instant, blood burst from Ju Wunhyang's mouth. After suffering internal injuries, he should have circulated his energy and expelled the death chi that had entered his body, but by continuously neglecting it, it had ravaged his 5 viscera and 6 bowels. Thud. Ugh. Seeing him collapse and vomit blood, Commander Seo Yeren's eyes became fierce. Along with it, killing intent rose. Sensing this, Mok Jeongun's eyes narrowed. The energy has risen. In his right eye, which had unleashed the power of the third eye, he could see her primordial true chi, which had become much larger than a moment ago. The energy was rippling in all directions. This woman might have reached the pinnacle of the transformation realm or possibly even higher. Swish. It was at that very moment. Commander Seo Yeren suddenly disappeared, and with a lightning-like trajectory drawn in his right eye, she appeared beside him. At this, Mok Jeongun hurriedly concentrated his energy and raised his left arm. Thud. Crack. The impact felt on his left arm. Along with it, Mok Jeongun's body was pushed to the side by more than 10 steps. Mok Jeongun, who had been pushed back like that, gritted his teeth and barely managed to avoid falling over. My left wrist is broken. This alone highlighted the stark difference in their power. Seemed to be at least twice as much. Barely enduring the trembling of his left wrist, he clenched his fist, and Seo Yeren warned Mok Jeongun, "It would be best for you to give it your all. I'll make you pay the price for putting trainee Ju Wunhyang in that state before I arrest you." With those words, Seo Yeren's figure disappeared again. She intended to subdue Mok Jeongun not half-heartedly but decisively, even if it meant breaking all the bones in his body. In that manner, she appeared on Mok Jeongun's right side in an instant and unleashed a leg technique towards his right ribs. At that moment, Mok Jeongun blocked it with his right arm. Thud. Naturally, she thought he would be repelled again this time. Whoosh. However, Mok Jeongun's body was pushed back by only about 3 steps. Crackle. Crackle. At that moment, Seo Yeren's eyes saw Mok Jeongun's right hand bulging with blood vessels and turning black. As if his hand was transforming into that of a ferocious demon, she frowned and muttered, "What on earth? Phew. Aesthetically, it's not pleasing to the eye, so I didn't want to show this, but I have no choice." It was the evil acupoint demonic technique. It was a method to temporarily amplify energy through the great technique of reversing acupoints. Ordinary martial artists would rapidly consume their true original energy or go out of control when using this, but Mok Jae-un could perfectly control it by utilizing it partially. He amplified the energy in only one hand? Commander Seo Yeren was inwardly amazed. Just how much was he hiding? Soon, Mok Jae-un, who had amplified the energy in his right hand using the evil acupoint demonic technique, took a sword finger stance. This sword finger stance was none other than Demonic Sword Art, First Stance. It was the first stance of the sword art he had created. Demonic Sword Art? Why did you name it that instead of just calling it a sword art? I want to combine the cultivation method and sword art into one instead of troublesomely separating them. Combining the cultivation method and sword art into one? Yes. Mok Jae-un, who had come up with this strange idea, had named this sword art the Demonic Sword Art. The first stance of the Demonic Sword Art could be considered the best technique Mok Jae-un could currently unleash. Pot. At that moment, Mok Jae-un leaped forward. Even though he could perfectly control the evil acupoint demonic technique, the time he could maintain it was short, so he did it to quickly decide the match. Whoosh. The moment Mok Jae-un unleashed his sword technique, the amplified black strong energy created a massive trajectory, sweeping forward with a momentum like a raging wave, as if it would engulf everything in front of him. Faced with the tremendous momentum of the sword technique, Seo Yeren's expression became noticeably serious, unlike before. Moderation won't work. The sword technique before her eyes was a matchless sword technique. It seemed impossible to block it with an ordinary technique. At this, Seo Yeren overlapped her index and middle fingers of her right hand to form sword fingers, and then she firmly stepped on the ground and pulled them back. Roar. At that moment, her sword fingers condensed intense energy from the fingertips, as if they were the eye of a typhoon. Flinch. Mok Jae-un's eyes sharpened. It felt dangerous. He had never seen energy being raised to this extent before. However, he was already in the midst of unleashing his sword technique, so he had no choice but to clash. Crash. Seo Yeren thrust out the hand she had pulled back, as if piercing through the approaching Mok Jae-un. At that moment, a sharp murderous intent arose, and it created a whirlwind of sword energy. Clang 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 clang. Surprisingly, the power of the two matchless techniques that collided was in a stalemate. Zhu Wenxiang, who had been circulating his energy and barely managing his internal injuries after vomiting a mouthful of blood, couldn't hide his shock at this sight. He knew Mok Jae-un was strong from having faced him, but Commander Seo Yeren, who could be considered his teacher, was a hidden expert whose strength was unknown. If she were to use her full power, he could confidently say that her martial prowess would be stronger than even the 8 stars, who were called the top experts. However, a stalemate. The sight of these two techniques clashing was truly astonishing. It was like a raging wave and a whirlwind colliding. The sword energy unleashed by the two ceaselessly intertwined, neither side giving way even slightly. Clang 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 clang. Even the person involved, Seo Yeren, was surprised. To have power on par with the true condensed spiral sword? She too was greatly amazed by Mok Jae-un's matchless sword technique. She had thought it was extraordinary, but she never expected it to have power comparable to her best technique, which she was most confident in. It feels like my whole body will be torn apart. On the other hand, Mok Jae-un was focusing all his senses on the sword technique. If he made a single mistake, he would be caught in this whirlwind of sword energy and have his entire body torn to shreds. He had already reached the 18th out of 24 stances. Since Seo Yeren's sword energy was also gradually losing its momentum, he just needed to endure a little longer. Or so he thought, but at that moment, it's been a long time since I've encountered such a matchless swordsman. With those words, she stepped on the ground with her other foot and firmly stepped down. Thud. Along with it, she withdrew her right hand and pulled back her left hand's sword fingers, then thrust them forward. Whoosh 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 whoosh. Seeing this, Mok Jae-un's pupils trembled. Continuously. He never anticipated that the technique would continue in this manner, intertwined with the end of the sword technique's momentum. Moreover, this time the sword energy rotated in reverse, continuing with a momentum quite different from before. Since the direction had changed, it became even more difficult to block it. Crackle. Crackle. Even the evil acupoint demonic technique had reached its limit. In the first place, it was a technique that rapidly amplified energy through the great technique of reversing acupoints, so maintaining it for a long time was unreasonable. Would he be defeated like this? In Mok Jaeongun's eyes, the center of the massive whirlwind was visible. All the momentum was surging from there. At that moment, Mok Jaeongun's eyes flashed. I need to aim at the point where the momentum originates. To do that, he needed a force that could overwhelm that momentum even for a moment. Even if it was just for a single instant. The moment he realized this, Mok Jaeongun's thoughts began to converge into one. And that converged thought reached a simple conclusion. Gather into one. He would concentrate all the stances of his strongest sword technique, the demonic sword art, into one. It was no different from gathering all the sword energy and stances contained within the sword technique into one. With Mok Jaeongun's current realm, this was an almost impossible task. However, driven to the edge of a cliff, Mok Jaeongun's thoughts and will cross the boundary that ordinary people could never surpass. Has he given up? On the other hand, seeing Mok Jaeongun's sword energy weakening, Seo Yerin sensed that he couldn't win and thought he had given up. But it was at that very moment. Whoosh 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 whoosh. The 24 trajectories of black light that had been extending while scattering particles of dark light dispersed simultaneously and converged into a single point. And a black line was drawn through the center of the whirlwind of sword energy. Clang. Along with it, an astonishing sight unfolded. Before anyone knew it, Mok Jaeongun had passed Seo Yerin and was standing behind her, grasping his sword fingers and exhaling roughly, while the whirlwind of sword energy she had created had vanished without a trace. Moreover, drip drip, blood droplets fell to the ground, flowing along her left hand's sword fingers that had been lowered. Chapter 241, Turning Misfortune into Blessing. 1. Blood dripped down from Seo Yerin's left sword finger. And about 5 feet behind her stood Mok Jaeongun, breathing heavily. Ju Wunhyang's expression as she looked at the two of them was close to shock. How could this be? Thought. She had expected to see Mok Jaeongun being brutally defeated by Seo Yerin's hand, but the opposite result had occurred. The peerless sword technique she unleashed had been thoroughly shattered. One could tell just by looking at the intense whirlwind of sword energy that had vanished in an instant. Of course, she wasn't the only one surprised. He dismantled the technique. Seo Yerin, the sixth sky demon, was also at a loss for words from shock. While there had been those who blocked this continuous true-chasing second revolving sword technique when she used it, no one had ever dismantled it before. After all, this chasing second revolving sword was a technique that maximized power and compensated for weaknesses through clockwise and counterclockwise rotations. Yet Mok Jaeongun had shattered it. And he did so by unifying all of his sword energy into a single point. How could something like this happen? This was something even Seo Yerin herself couldn't do. Gathering sword energy into a single point was a realm that even she couldn't reach at her current level. Yet he had entered that supreme realm in an instant? Even though she saw it with her own eyes and directly experienced it, it was unbelievable. To think such talent existed in this world. It was beyond imagination. Was this the level of talent her great-grandfather, once called the pinnacle of the old martial arts world, possessed? No matter how outstanding one's martial talent was, reaching a level that surpassed one's own limits, let alone entering a realm one couldn't access, during a duel was something utterly incomprehensible. Drip. Cold sweat trickled down her cheeks. Her left hand had already lost strength due to Mok Jaeongun's unified sword technique. If he unleashed this technique that transcended the realm of limitations once more, she wondered if she could even block it. No. At times like this, fighting spirit is crucial. Even he would have difficulty executing such a technique again. Since he had used a technique that far exceeded his own limits, his body must have been strained. If she targeted that point, subduing him was still well within reach. Moreover, she had yet to use her unique skill. Swoosh. Seo Yerin flicked the blood off her left sword finger and tightly clenched her right sword finger. Then as she turned her body, she spoke. Impressive. However, I also... Thud. It was at that moment. Mok Jaeongun, who had been breathing roughly, suddenly collapsed to the floor. Hazy steam rose from his fallen body. Seeing this, Seo Yerin furrowed her brows, unable to hide her bewilderment. She approached the fallen Mok Jaeongun. Even heat could be felt as if his body temperature had skyrocketed. Swish. Seo Yerin placed a finger on one of Mok Jaeongun's acupoints. Then, after examining the exposed parts of his body, She clicked her tongue with trembling eyes. His entire body was severely swollen with bruises, as if all his muscles had ruptured, and even the strange energy within his body was raging erratically like someone who had lost control. His body has been overused beyond the extreme. Is this the price of that single sword strike that surpassed his abilities and limits? The condition was more serious than she thought. But it wasn't incomprehensible either. After all, that single sword strike wasn't something the current Mok Jaeongun should have been able to execute. Since he wielded a sword his body couldn't endure, this was probably the natural consequence. Ha! Seo Yeren let out a sigh. With this degree of internal and external injuries, participating in the embroidered uniform guard selection was impossible from the start, and continuing to participate itself seemed unreasonable. If he couldn't control his blood vessels, meridians and internal energy here, he might lose his martial arts forever. However, all of this was something he brought upon himself. This bastard tried to kill Wen Xiang and the trainee Wei Buchong. In the end, he must be punished for what he did. There was no need to go out of her way to help him. It would be better to refer him for disciplinary action in this state. Sixth Sky Demon. At that moment, upon hearing Zhu Wenxiang's voice, Seo Yeren turned her head. Thud. The sound of a window opening could be heard. Soon, the chilly autumn wind slapped his cheeks, causing him to regain consciousness. Zhu Wenxiang slowly opened his closed eyes. It was difficult to understand what had happened. He clearly remembered talking to Seo Yeren about what had happened with Mok Jaeongun before losing consciousness. Ugh. His stomach felt as if it had been turned inside out. Dizziness washed over him, but as he regulated his breathing, it soon subsided. Where am I? In addition to the cold air, the scent of medicinal herbs permeated the room. It seemed this place wasn't his dormitory. As he was feeling puzzled, a clear voice reached his ears. You're awake. Sixth Sky Demon. The owner of that voice was none other than his teacher, Seo Yeren. Zhu Wenxiang hurriedly raised his upper body from the bed. However, perhaps due to his internal injuries, he couldn't even sit up halfway. Seo Yeren spoke to him as he struggled. Don't strain yourself. Your internal injuries were quite severe. Fortunately, I treated them with internal energy, so if you circulate your energy for about 2 days, you'll be fine. Did you heal me, master? I'm the only one who can treat you. Aya. Zhu Wenxiang let out an exclamation at her words. It was because they shared the same innate true energy that she could treat and heal his internal energy. Zhu Wenxiang slowly circulated his innate true energy and examined his body. Zhu Wenxiang furrowed his brows for a moment. The amount of innate true energy within his body had increased significantly compared to usual. If he gained enlightenment with this much energy, he could reach the 4-star level. Zhu Wenxiang looked at her with surprised eyes. Sixth Sky Demon. How could this? Seo Yeren shook her head and spoke to the astonished Zhu Wenxiang. You've also mastered the innate true energy, so you know it differs from regular internal energy. Of course he knew that. Ordinary internal energy masters couldn't control innate true energy. Only she could assist in treating his injuries. The innate true energy I injected to treat you was more than I expected. This injury has turned misfortune into a blessing for you. She spoke calmly, but Zhu Wenxiang clicked his tongue inwardly. It was quite a large amount of innate true energy. Of course, for her level it might not be considered much. Zhu Wenxiang endured the pain and forcefully clasped his hands in salute. Thank you, Sixth Sky Demon. How can I repay this favor? Before he could finish, Seo Yeren shook her head again. Then with a soft sigh she said, It's fine. More importantly, you were right. About what? As you said, it seems trainee Wei Buchong had indeed stuck a poison needle into the wooden pillow of the bed. The Poison Investigation Unit has already confirmed it. Ah. It was Zhu Wenxiang who had defended Mok Jaeongun to the best of his ability before fainting. In fact, he didn't have to defend him. Even though Mok Jaeongun had changed his mind halfway, it was true that he had tried to kill Zhu Wenxiang. However, he owed a debt to Mok Jaeongun and strangely didn't want to do that. So he had made sure Seo Yeren cleared up the misunderstanding. Therefore, since trainee Mok Jaeongun saved your life and considering what you explained, he received a suspension of indictment as a mitigating factor. Embroidered uniform guards had arrived at the scene while he was defending Mok Jaeongun. No matter how many nearby guard warriors he had knocked unconscious by sealing their acupoints, it would have been stranger if the nearby embroidered uniform guards on duty hadn't noticed such an intense fight. Regardless of the circumstances, Mok Jae-eun, who had escalated the incident, was referred to the disciplinary department, but ultimately received a suspension of indictment. Thank you, Six Sky Demon. No need. However, even though trainee Mok Jae-eun received a suspension of indictment, he may have to voluntarily withdraw from the embroidered uniform guard selection. What? What does that mean? Could it be because of Mok Jae-eun's injuries? He had already guessed that Mok Jae-eun's body had been strained after shattering Seo Yeon's technique and suddenly collapsing. So Ju Wonhyang asked, "Are his injuries severe?" Yes. He drew out a power that exceeded his own abilities. She recalled the conversation she had with the embroidered uniform guard's exclusive imperial physician last night. How is it? Even though I wanted to control his internal energy, I couldn't do anything because he possessed a completely opposite energy to mine. Oh my. I don't know how to tell you this. What do you mean? As a physician, I don't practice martial arts, so it's difficult for me to speak about energy, but there are too many ruptured muscles and blood vessels throughout his body. I'm aware of that. I just want to know if he'll recover. With this extent of injuries, recovery in the near future is absolutely impossible. Then is it possible if he takes time? It's hard to give you a definite answer. Since major muscles are torn and ruptured in many places, even if he recovers, he may have difficulty moving as he did before. It was an unfortunate situation, but it was serious. The circulation of his internal energy was also a mess, and it wasn't just regular internal energy but an energy completely opposite to innate true energy, so she couldn't treat it as she had done for Ju Wonhyang. With a body like this, continuing the embroidered uniform guard selection process was unreasonable. She might have to advise him to voluntarily withdraw as soon as he woke up. Late the next night, there are various ranks within the Imperial Hospital. Among them, the lowest rank, the 9th grade Shambong, had to be on standby at all times to check on patients' conditions, even if not in the dispensary. Cho Chambong, a 9th grade physician of the Embroidered Uniform Guard's internal hospital, clicked his tongue while looking at a patient with needles stuck all over his body. His entire body was covered in bruises, and it was the first time he had seen a patient like this. You won't have many opportunities to examine a patient in such a critically severe condition. So, observe and record in detail. Yes, Supervisor. Upon receiving orders from the Embroidered Uniform Guard's 6th Sky Demon, his senior, the 7th grade physician Supervisor J, who was diagnosing and treating the patient, gave him the opportunity to examine the patient as well. Supervisor J had already judged that this patient's complete recovery was virtually impossible. In fact, he had felt the same when he personally checked the patient's pulse and examined the affected areas. With this degree of damage to the muscles and blood vessels, the patient might not be able to move properly for a long time, or even walk properly for the rest of his life. What in the world did he do to end up like this? It was utterly incomprehensible. With such thoughts, Cho Chambong sat next to the patient with a decoction in hand. He slowly dipped a cloth into the medicine and placed it inside the patient's mouth. For unconscious patients, the tongue is brought into contact with the soaked cloth to allow them to absorb even a small amount of the medicinal energy. Swish. Cho Chambong, who had placed the cloth on the patient's tongue, checked his pulse. Then one of his eyebrows trembled and rose. What's this? Something was strange. Just last night, the patient's pulse was extremely irregular and weak. But now the pulse was steady. Finding this odd, Cho Chambong checked not only the pulse on the wrist but also the major acupoints, including the neck. Doing so, he stood up with a surprised expression. What's going on? How could this happen overnight? Thinking that he should report this to his senior who was in the dormitory, Cho Chambong entrusted the task of administering the medicine to a dispensary worker and hurriedly left. Not long after he left, the door opened and someone entered. As the person entered, the dispensary worker who was holding the medicinal cloth to the patient's mouth was startled and stood up to greet him. What brings you here so late at night, Your Excellency? An old eunuch in a red official robe with face powder. He was none other than Eunuch Biam of the Western Depot. Eunuch Biam approached the dispensary worker and asked, I came to check on the patient's condition. The dispensary worker couldn't help but feel inwardly puzzled by these words. That was because he knew this patient was a guard trainee participating in the embroidered uniform guard selection. Why would a eunuch from the Western Depot come to see such a person? Although puzzled, the dispensary worker stepped aside and said, "The patient's condition is not very good, so it will take several more days for him to wake up." "Is it that serious?" "That's what the attending physician, Supervisor Bay, said." Is that so? It seems quite severe. From what I heard, even if he's lucky enough to wake up, he won't be able to move for a while, and he may not be able to walk properly for the rest of his life. Upon hearing the dispensary worker's words, the corners of Eunuch Biam's mouth slightly curled up. The dispensary worker's suspicion grew even more at that sight. The patient's condition is said to be poor, but why does he seem pleased? Finding it strange, Eunuch Biam said, "Could you give me a moment alone? But the medicine needs to be administered now." "But it won't take long." With those words, Eunuch Biam took out a bundle of silver coins from his bosom. The dispensary worker gulped at the sight of this. Then he quietly accepted the bundle of silver coins, bowed his head and left the room. Once alone, Eunuch Biam approached the patient who had needles stuck all over his body and his eyes closed. "Ho ho ho." Eunuch Biam laughed, unable to contain his joy. He had never expected things to go so smoothly. Just until yesterday he had been sweating profusely, pleading for reconsideration, saying that this fellow had endangered His Majesty and himself because that person had shown interest in him. However, that person's judgment was different. Even if he was someone who had endangered His Majesty and himself, if he was such an outstanding talent, that person wanted to bring him under his wing somehow. He even gave orders to meet with the fellow and arrange a position for him. For Eunuch Biam, it was an order that couldn't have been more troublesome. But the heavens helped him. It was Mok Jiongun, wasn't it? Eunuch Biam looked down at Mok Jiongun and grinned. He had thought that a monstrous fellow like him would rarely be defeated by anyone, but how coincidental was this? It was an opportunity given by the heavens. For the sake of His Majesty himself and that person, a guy like this must never be allowed to come close. So, with certainty, "I'll shatter your Danjian, you bastard." If that happened, even the slightest possibility of him rising from the dead would completely vanish. With that in mind, Eunuch Biam brought his hand toward Mok Jiongun's abdomen. Just as his palm was about to touch the skin below the navel. "What are you doing?" In an instant, Eunuch Biam's body froze as he was about to place his palm. What the fuck was that just now? Did he mishear? He was clearly told that the patient's injuries were severe and he wouldn't wake up for several days. But what the hell was going on? Could it be? Eunuch Biam's eyes slowly moved from the abdomen up the chest, neck and then to the face. Thump. At that moment his heart sank. That's because Mok Jiongun, who had been lying as if dead with his eyes closed, had suddenly opened his eyes wide and was staring at him. Chapter 242. Turning Misfortune into Blessing. Eunuch Biam, the eunuch from the Western Depot, couldn't hide his bewilderment. He had been reassured after hearing from Supervisor J, the physician in charge of the embroidered uniform guard, that Mok Jiongun's injuries were so severe that he wouldn't wake up for several days. However, Mok Jiongun, who had been lying as if dead with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes and stared at him, causing Eunuch Biam to be startled. What's going on? He wasn't sure what had happened, but it seemed Mok Jiongun had woken up earlier than the physician's prediction. Eunuch Biam, whose heart had nearly leaped out of his chest from shock, quickly composed himself. Although he had been surprised by Mok Jiongun's opened eyes, Mok Jiongun was still an injured man. Wasn't it said that his condition was so dire that he might never walk properly again? They say you get scared by the ladle after being frightened by the snake. It seemed the defeat he had suffered there had greatly affected him. There was no need for him to be intimidated in this situation, but he had unconsciously shrunk back. Chuck. Eunuch Biam, who had hesitated, hurriedly placed his hand above Mok Jiongun's Danjian. Mok Jiongun, who had been staring at him, raised an eyebrow and spoke. "What are you trying to do? Your name is Mok Jiongun, isn't it? So what? Ha. Your imposing manner is still impressive. To not even blink an eye in this situation, he has a grand presence indeed." In a state where he couldn't move due to his injuries, Eunuch Biam had his hand placed above Mok Jiongun's Danjian. This meant that with just a little force he could shatter Mok Jayongun's Danjian. Yet Mok Jayongun showed no sign of dismay. Rather, he was incredibly calm. Quack. Eunuch Biam pressed his fingers into the area around Mok Jayongun's Danjian, applying force. Then he spoke. This may be misfortune for you, but the heavens are on your side. Accept the consequences of insulting His Majesty and shattering this old man's shoulder without resentment. His Majesty? Seeing Mok Jayongun's puzzled expression, Eunuch Biam scoffed and said, Didn't this old man clearly warn you not to provoke that noble person? That noble identity you spoke of was His Majesty? Don't carelessly utter his name. A ruffian from the martial arts world like you has no right to speak of him so casually. Eunuch Biam scolded him sternly. In response, Mok Jayongun chuckled and said, The title, His Majesty, must be quite revered, seeing as you tell me not to even mention it. Insolent fellow. This guy's arrogance was astounding. However, his sarcastic attitude in this situation was truly irritating. Eunuch Biam gathered his internal energy and formed a sharp chi on his fingertips, stabbing it into Mok Jayongun's abdomen. About one knuckle of his finger penetrated the abdomen. Eunuch Biam curved the corners of his mouth mockingly. Now even this guy should realize that he was in a position where he had to beg and plead. Eunuch Biam furrowed his brows. Even though 5 of his fingers had penetrated about one knuckle deep into the abdomen, Mok Jayongun was staring at him without any change in expression. He seemed to possess an incredibly strong endurance. At this point he should have been groveling pathetically. However, Mok Jayongun opened his mouth. It's a bit different from what I expected. I don't think the person above your master would have ordered you to kill me. This bastard. Eunuch Biam's eyes flickered with surprise. How did this guy guess the intentions of that person? As he wondered, Mok Jayongun tilted his head slightly and continued. If they had sent an even stronger eunuch to test me, it doesn't seem like they would have done that. But since you're acting this way, is it because I'm injured and the person above you has changed their mind? Or are you defying their orders and seeking revenge on me, not wanting to miss the opportunity while I'm injured? Eunuch Biam was momentarily dumbfounded. Who the hell was this guy? He was reading the situation based on fragmented circumstances without even knowing who that person was. Due to the incident at the inn amidst the heavy rain, Eunuch Biam had already considered Mok Jayongun to have an exceptionally sharp mind, bordering on being vicious, but this left him tongue-tied. This guy's true value wasn't limited to his martial arts. His intelligence was also outstanding. That made him even more fearsome. My judgment is indeed correct. This guy must never be allowed near His Highness. Although Eunuch Biam had wanted to see Mok Jayongun looking fearful or pathetic, now he only thought of quickly shattering his Danjian. As he tried to apply force to his fingers, tremble. Suddenly, as if blocked by something, his fingers couldn't penetrate the flesh. Moreover, the internal energy that had been in his fingers gradually dissipated. What in the world? At that moment of bewilderment, his fingers, which had penetrated with a strong repulsive force from inside the body, were expelled outward. What was going on here? Both the physician and the embroidered uniform guard supervising the martial arts had said that Mok Jayongun's internal injuries were so severe that he would have difficulty controlling his own body. With ruptured blood vessels, muscles, and disrupted internal energy circulation, he should have been no different from a cripple. Yet how could he exert this level of power? Eunuch Biam, who had been momentarily astonished, tried to strike Mok Jayongun's abdomen again. I must destroy his Danjian. Regardless of what had happened, if he destroyed the Danjian, everything would be over. Just as Eunuch Biam's palm was about to crash down on Mok Jayongun's Danjian with enough force to shatter not only the Danjian but also the internal organs, an unexpected event occurred. It was papapapapak. The needles inserted all over Mok Jayongun's body were ejected outward. If they had simply been pulled out, it would have been fine, but each needle was imbued with internal energy, scattering in all directions like hidden weapons. PFFT 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 PFFT. Hook. Eunuch Biam hurriedly waved his hands trying to block them, but 7 needles pierced through his body. Although they were thin needles, 3 penetrated his abdomen, 1 his shoulder, 1 above his right clavicle, and the others pierced through his left palm and right thigh. The pain was so excruciating that Eunuch Biam collapsed backward. Particularly, the areas where the needles had penetrated his abdomen and above his clavicle were in a dire state. They were all vital acupuncture points. Eunuch Biam hastily circulated his internal energy, trying to block the punctured areas. However, the internal energy is dissipating. Centered around the punctured areas, his internal energy was scattering. In a panic, Eunuch Biam drew upon more internal energy and circulated it. If the internal energy was dissipating, the only way to overcome it was with stronger internal energy. Right at that moment, Eunuch Biam's eyes widened. He saw Mok Jiongun sitting up from the bed. But that wasn't all. Black steam began to emanate from his entire body, and the bruised skin gradually lightened in color. Could it be that he's healing? No matter how he looked at it, that seemed to be the only explanation. His speculation was correct. As Mok Jiongun sat up and circulated the rampaging energy within his body, it stabilized, and the bruised skin rapidly restored itself. In fact, Mok Jiongun's body had undergone a miraculous self-recovery overnight, and the remaining external wounds were healing. Ah! A small gasp escaped Mok Jiongun's mouth. This was because, as he circulated and soothed the rampaging energy within his body, he noticed that the amount of energy had significantly increased compared to before. Especially the demonic energy, which had increased by more than 40%. What's this? Even Mok Jiongun himself had been aware when he collapsed. The technique of concentrating sword energy into one had surpassed the limits of his body and enlightenment. As a result, his overexerted body couldn't endure it and had broken down. This was the first time such a thing had happened since he began cultivating martial arts. "Are you all right, mortal?" Chong Ryong, who had been waiting for Mok Jiongun to wake up, asked with a worried voice. She too had been concerned that something might have gone wrong due to Mok Jiongun exerting a force beyond his limits and the physician's words. If it had been possible to possess Mok Jiongun, she would have wanted to temporarily take over his body and heal him. However, since possession was impossible for Mok Jiongun, she could only watch. "Yes. I feel much better now. How did you manage to exert such power?" "That power. The one where you unified the sword energy into one." Even she had been astonished upon witnessing Mok Jiongun's technique. It was a realm that even she, who still had lingering attachments to the sword even after death, couldn't imagine, let alone reach. Yet she wondered how this fellow had momentarily approached a domain close to the pinnacle of swordsmanship. "I'm not sure. Nothing else comes to mind." "You didn't think of anything else?" Upon hearing these words, Chong Ryong genuinely admired Mok Jiongun. In that fleeting moment, transcending any realm, he had considered that to be the only optimal move. Mok Jiongun had simply realized it. It was just that his enlightenment and body hadn't fully supported him, so he had borne the full brunt of the backlash. Chong Ryong, who had been clicking her tongue, finally spoke. "You bastard, you really are a born martial arts genius." Mok Jiongun's eyes flickered with surprise at her words. This was because she, who usually refrained from speaking even in ordinary situations, had given him a proper compliment for the first time. It seemed she acknowledged him to that extent. "But don't overexert yourself. Even if you momentarily approached such a realm through a heaven-defying enlightenment, you have now experienced firsthand the consequences of doing so when unprepared." "Well, that's true. But what?" Mok Jiongun silently clenched his fist tightly. The intensity of the force exerted by his hand. It had become much stronger than before he collapsed. It was as if the swollen and torn muscles had become even more robust to endure it. This wasn't a mere feeling. The blood vessels are the same. The speed at which energy circulated had greatly increased. Just like when he had surpassed the bottleneck, it had now become as natural as breathing. Because of this, Mok Jiongun himself felt a strange sensation. How curious. Would others also experience such a rapid change in their bodies when surpassing their limits? It didn't seem so. According to the medical knowledge he had learned from his grandfather and various medical texts, the human body was designed to slowly adapt to limits or harsh situations, not undergo such drastic changes. In that regard, he seemed to be distinctly different from ordinary people. At that moment, Mok Jiongun turned his head. There he saw Eunuch Biam from the Western Depot lying on the floor, dragging his body and trying to quietly escape while suppressing his presence. Mok Jiongun chuckled and got off the bed. Damn it. Startled, Eunuch Biam hurriedly struck the floor with both hands. Using the rebound force, he tried to stand up. However, thwack. Ugh. As he got up, Mok Jae-un kicked him, causing him to fall back down. Mok Jae-un pressed his foot on the area between Eunuch Beom's neck and chest. Quack. Coo. Pressing down on that area, it was impossible for Eunuch Beom to breathe properly. To the suffocating Eunuch Beom, Mok Jae-un said, "It seems you don't have much attachment to life." What? Just like last time, even though I was minding my own business, you deliberately provoked me. Flinch. At Mok Jae-un's words, Eunuch Beom's face turned red and then ashen. Struggling to breathe, he hastily said, If you try to harm me here, His Highness Prince Gyeongjin will never." So it was him. The corners of Mok Jae-un's mouth twitched. Seeing that expression, Eunuch Beom's eyes wavered. What was this? It was different from the reaction he had expected. Prince Gyeongjin was the younger brother of His Majesty the Emperor and one of the 4 true powers of this nation. With this cunning fellow, he should have understood what he meant, so why was he making such an ominous expression? Right at that moment, crack, crunch, the sound of a clavicle breaking rang out. Eunuch Beom couldn't hold back the scream of pain. Mok Jae-un kicked his chin. Thwack, crunch, coo. The sound of teeth colliding and shattering echoed. Mok Jae-un bent down and brought his face close to the suffering Eunuch Beom. "Does it hurt a lot?" Coo. As he opened his mouth, all of his teeth were cracked and broken pieces fell out with a clatter. Of course, they fell into his mouth, causing him to choke and sputter. Mok Jae-un grabbed the face of Eunuch Beom, who was coughing up blood, and examined it closely. Then he smiled brightly and said, "Fortunately, the skin on your face is intact." Upon hearing those words, the suffering Eunuch Beom furrowed his brows. What the hell was he talking about? After making his jaw and teeth like this, was he now saying that his face was fine? Damn bastard. You have made a grave mistake. In the end, by making him like this, he had gained justification to persuade His Highness. A dog that couldn't be leashed shouldn't be kept. Prepare yourself. Anyway, since there was also the crime of attempting to assassinate His Majesty, using this as justification, he would definitely. At that moment, Eunuch Beom's eyes widened. He felt a sharp blade penetrating his jaw and reaching inside his nose. The pain rushed in all at once, causing him to twist his body in a struggle. But then, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-tack. At that moment, Mok Jae-un sealed his acupoints, rendering him unable to move. Of course, he also sealed the points that would stop him from making any sound. In agony yet unable to speak, Eunuch Beom could only open his eyes wide as Mok Jae-un whispered softly in his ear. "It's a pity you didn't just die back then. If you did, none of this would have happened." Screech. With those words, Mok Jae-un carefully moved the blade up and down, as if he was delicately peeling off the skin. What are you doing? Eunuch Beom's eyes widened even further, his pupils shaking madly. Regardless, Mok Jae-un continued his work with an elated smile. Screech. Screech. Stop. Stop it. With his eyes wide open, Eunuch Beom watched as his facial skin was slowly peeled away, his pupils gradually losing focus. Chapter 243. Turning Misfortune into Blessing. 3. 2 government officials were hurriedly heading to the Embroidered Uniform Guard Hospital. They were Supervisor J, a 7th-grade physician, and Cho Chambong, a 9th-grade physician. With drowsy eyes, Supervisor J spoke in an irritated voice. "If what you say isn't true, you'd better be prepared for the consequences." "It's the truth. I even checked the 8 major pulses." "Oh my. You." Supervisor J shook his head. That's because the guard trainee named Mok Jae-un, who was hospitalized, was in no condition to wake up or improve in a short period of time. Yet how could his pulse return to normal overnight? After assigning night duty, it seemed like the physician had left his senses somewhere out of fatigue. Nonsense. He was determined to give him a good scolding. As they approached the hospital, they saw someone squatting outside, dozing off. It was the dispensary worker. "Hey, you rascal." Cho Chambong reprimanded him upon seeing him. The dispensary worker was startled and jumped up from his spot like a disciplined soldier. Then, noticing Supervisor J and Cho Chambong, he spoke in a flustered manner. "My lords. I told you to take care of my patient, yet you're slacking off." "That's not it." "What do you mean that's not it?" "Right now. A guest has come inside at the moment. A guest. Out of the blue, who was this guest? As they were wondering, the dispensary worker carefully said, "It's the junior supervisor eunuch of the Western Depot." Junior supervisor eunuch? At those words, Supervisor Jay and Cho Chambong looked at each other, unable to hide their bewilderment. Among the eunuchs of the Western Depot, the position of junior supervisor eunuch was high enough to directly attend to the imperial family. But why had a junior supervisor eunuch come to the embroidered uniform guard hospital? Thinking something was amiss, they hurriedly went inside. Upon entering, Cho Chambong, who was leading the way, looked around. Then, seeing a bed, he couldn't hide his perplexity. Gasp. Seeing him so shocked that he almost fell backward, Supervisor Jay and the dispensary worker also looked in that direction. However, eek. What is this? The reason for their shock was simple. On the bed where the patient should have been lying, something torn into dozens of pieces was placed. As physicians, they could immediately sense what it was. It was none other than a dismembered corpse. Faced with such a horrific sight, they were utterly perplexed about what to do. As they stood there, shocked and at a loss, a rustling sound came from somewhere. They simultaneously turned their heads. It was in front of the medicinal herb drawers where various medicinal ingredients were stored, and someone wearing a red official robe could be seen. "My lord." The dispensary worker unknowingly called out to him. Then the person in the red official robe turned his head and grinned eerily in the flickering lantern light. Baijiang Palace. This was the palace where Prince Jiangjin, one of the four most powerful figures in the country, resided. Originally, Prince Jiangjin was governing the Sichuan region as a royal relative, but when the current emperor, who had cherished him even before his enthronement, ascended to the throne, he was summoned to the capital, Kaifeng, and a palace was given to him to stay in. Although the emperor cherished his younger brother, he added the character Bai, meaning to be cautious and diligent, to the name of the palace to remind him not to forget his proper place. Of course, despite the emperor's consideration, Prince Jiangjin had steadily expanded his influence, leading to his current position. Swish. A middle-aged man in his mid-50s, exuding elegance, turned the page of an old book. A middle-aged eunuch in a red official robe quietly observed him from near the door. Just by looking at his splendid official attire, one could guess his position. The middle-aged eunuch was none other than the chief eunuch of the Western Depot. Swish. The middle-aged man, who had been turning the pages at a steady pace, finally spoke. "Eunuch Biam is late." At his words, the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, spoke in a groveling voice. "Your Highness, shall I send someone to fetch him?" The identity of the elegant middle-aged man with an impressive mustache was none other than Prince Jiangjin, the master of this Baijiang Palace. As one of the four most powerful figures who controlled the country, he exuded not only elegance but also an arrogant and extraordinary spirit that seemed to encompass all things. "No, it's fine. When the time comes, he will come on his own." "Understood, Your Highness." At Prince Jiangjin's words, the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, bowed his head with his hands clasped together. However, concern was evident in his eyes as he bowed. "He won't disobey Your Highness's order, will he?" He had already seen Eunuch Biam unable to hide his joy upon hearing the news that Mok Jiangun, the late-stage disciple sent by the Heaven and Earth Society, had suffered severe injuries. That worried him quite a bit. He must have been very scared. He could fully understand such feelings. According to the reports, it was natural for anyone to rejoice and not miss this opportunity after suffering such injuries and humiliation. However, this was not an opportunity for him. Examine that person's condition. We cannot lose such a valuable talent. Prince Jiangjin wanted to have that late-stage disciple from the Heaven and Earth Society. Being someone with a strong desire for talented individuals, he didn't care at all that Mok Jiangun had threatened the princess he cherished. On the contrary, he said that someone like him was all the more worth taming. This might be the difference between those with the ambition to rule the world and ordinary people. Eunuch Biam, please refrain from doing anything foolish. If he took this as an opportunity to do something foolish, His Highness would not forgive him. His Highness disliked those who disobeyed his orders more than anyone else. At that moment, Prince Jiangjin closed the book he was reading and spoke. "By the way, how is that wench still unharmed?" "If you're referring to that wench." I'm talking about that wench from Auspicious Palace. You mean Consort Ho, your highness. Consort Ho. The emperor had numerous women. Among them there were two women who received his particular favor. Imperial noble Consort Seo and Consort Ho. Originally, the emperor favored Imperial noble Consort Seo the most, but he also didn't hesitate to show affection to Consort Nam and Consort Seomun, who bore his children. Consort Seomun had a deep connection to Prince Gyeongjin's maternal side, his mother's family. Therefore, Prince Gyeongjin had spared no investment and effort to ensure that Consort Seomun could receive the emperor's favor. However, at some point the dynamics within the inner court had changed. It was because of the sudden appearance of Consort Ho. A peerless beauty that one couldn't help but be captivated by. This was what everyone who saw Consort Ho said in unison. The appearance of the palace maid who had just entered the palace was so outstanding that rumors spread, saying her beauty rivaled that of Imperial noble Consort Seo, who was called the epitome of beauty. Naturally, the story reached the ears of the lascivious emperor. A mere 3 years. It hadn't been long since she entered the palace. A young wench from a palace-maid background without any backing had enchanted the emperor with her appearance alone and reached the position of consort in just 3 years. Even Consort Seomun, who had given birth to a son, couldn't become a consort. A dangerous wench. At least Imperial noble Consort Seo had won the emperor's heart over a long period of time. But this woman had achieved it in just 3 years. Prince Gyeongjin couldn't understand it. Although the emperor was lascivious and couldn't resist any woman, his conquests were also quite severe and he would quickly lose interest. Even with his beloved Imperial noble Consort Seo, he never stayed with her for more than 3 days. However, he stayed in Consort Ho's quarters for as long as half a month, showing an immense favor towards her. What kind of sorcery is she using? Because of this, Prince Gyeongjin and the other powerful figures also considered her dangerous. Even when they tried to bring her under their control, strangely, everyone failed. Prince Gyeongjin had also tried to do so but to no avail. He even tried to meet her in person and turn her to his side, but he ended up hearing humiliating words from her instead. If you're a royal relative, why don't you live in accordance with your proper place and prostrate yourself flat? Upon hearing these words, Prince Gyeongjin was greatly enraged. No matter how much she was a consort favored by the emperor, she couldn't dare say such things to him so recklessly. In the end, Prince Gyeongjin decided to use an extreme measure. It was to use a slow-acting poison to make Consort Ho slowly die. Unlike other concubines, she had no backing or people to help her, so even if her body weakened, there would be no one suitable for her to turn to for help. So Prince Gyeongjin intended to subjugate her when she was weakened. However, 2 months have passed, yet why is there no effect at all? At Prince Gyeongjin's question, the chief eunuch Ho answered with a troubled expression. I apologize, Your Highness. In fact, Eunuch Ho was also puzzled by this. That's because he was told that the effects would appear in a month. But even after that period had passed, Consort Ho remained perfectly fine. So he had instructed the palace maid who had been planted to increase the dose of the slow-acting poison. Nevertheless, 2 months had passed but Consort Ho showed no signs of weakness. On the contrary, there was even an illusion that her complexion was getting better by the day. Isn't there a stronger poison? I apologize, Your Highness, but according to the person who manufactured the poison, if the dose is increased further, it may be detected by the food taster palace maids or the supervisor of the imperial hospital. At Eunuch Ho's words, Prince Gyeongjin let out a soft sigh. With Imperial noble Consort Seo alone being a handful, if Consort Ho were to give birth to a son on top of that, the political situation could become even more chaotic. Should I focus on preventing her from conceiving instead? However, this was something the other 3 powerful figures would take action on even if he didn't. From their perspective, it was also an undesirable situation. Just as his thoughts were becoming complicated, a eunuch's voice was heard from outside. Your Highness, Eunuch Biam requests an audience. He's finally here. Let him in. Yes, Your Highness. The door opened and Eunuch Biam, who had his head bowed and hands clasped together, entered. He bowed and greeted Prince Gyeongjin. The chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, who was watching him, had a glint in his eyes. That's because, unlike the usual Eunuch Biam, he seemed calm. Even his energy was well concealed, making it difficult to sense. Eunuch Ho's eyes narrowed. No matter how much Eunuch Biam had reached the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm, Eunuch Ho was a peerless master counted among the top 4 in the palace. He shouldn't be able to completely hide his energy from me. As he was finding it strange, Prince Gyeongjin gestured for Eunuch Biam to come closer and spoke. So, how is that person's condition? Is he likely to recover? Step. At this question, Eunuch Biam, with his head bowed, tried to take a step forward. At that moment, Eunuch Ho quickly blocked his way with a swift lightfoot technique. Stop right there. Prince Gyeongjin frowned and asked. Eunuch Ho, what are you doing? Your Highness, please allow me to examine Eunuch Biam for a moment. Examine him? What do you mean? Eunuch Biam, raise your head. Eunuch Ho told Eunuch Biam, who had his head bowed, to lift his head. Eunuch Biam slowly lowered his hands and raised his face. Eunuch Biam's face, with the characteristic powdered makeup of eunuchs, looked no different from usual. However, if there was one thing different, these eyes. Eunuch Biam, who was always cautious in everything when standing before His Highness Prince Gyeongjin and the head of the Western Depot, had a face and eyes that were utterly calm. Eunuch Ho's eyes sharpened as he grasped the handle of the leather belt at his waist and drew it out. Shing. As he pulled the leather belt, a soft sword hidden inside was revealed. Pointing the tip of the soft sword at Eunuch Biam, Eunuch Ho spoke in a voice filled with vigilance. Who are you, you bastard? Eunuch Biam remained silent at his question. Prince Gyeongjin, who had also sensed something suspicious, stood up from his seat and grabbed the sheath he had hung on the decorative stand behind him. What on earth was going on? Just then Eunuch Biam's lips twitched and he opened his mouth. Ah, this is why quick-witted people are troublesome. This was not Eunuch Biam's voice. His voice was hoarse, mixed with the characteristic gruffness of an old eunuch. But this voice was very young. Chapter 244, Prince Gyeongjin 1. Ah, this is why quick-witted people are troublesome. The young voice coming from the mouth of Eunuch Biam, an eunuch of the Western Depot. As soon as they heard it, vigilance filled the eyes of Prince Gyeongjin and the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho. Having been with Eunuch Biam for a long time, they could naturally distinguish him by his voice alone. Chief Eunuch Ho spoke while pointing his soft sword. Who the hell are you? There are definitely limitations with just the face. What? Seems like you were lucky back there. The corners of Eunuch Biam's mouth twitched. Eunuch Biam, or rather the true identity behind that face, was Mok Gyeongun. From the moment he entered Prince Gyeongjin's palace, Mok Gyeongun had no intention of avoiding being discovered at all costs, and through them he realized the weaknesses of the human skin mask. It was difficult to deceive the energy of a master with keen senses like Eunuch Ho, even if he could fool them with just the face. Without internal energy, it would be difficult with just deception. If he could manipulate the yang energy of internal energy, he would have imitated the unique energy emitted by Eunuch Biam. However, Mok Gyeongun's energy was different from others, so he couldn't do that. Moreover, if the voice was distinctly different or if he tried to deceive those who had known the face of this human skin for a long time, it was virtually impossible. Considering this, it could be said that he was lucky at the Yunmok sword manner. That's because the real Mok Gyeongun had such a bad reputation that he didn't interact with his half-siblings, let alone his servants. In conclusion, the human skin mask is not a card to be used in this way. It was difficult to deceive those who knew the face or were close to him. However, that didn't mean this was a useless card. If he changed his approach, he could create amusing situations like before. It depends on how you think about it. Right then. Swish. The soft sword of the chief eunuch Ho aimed at the space between his eyebrows. In an instant, Mok Gyeongun slightly tilted his head back and narrowly dodged the tip of the soft sword. Swish. He dodged it. It may have looked like a light strike, but it was an extremely fast thrust that even masters at the pinnacle stage of Transcendent Realm would find difficult to avoid. Yet when Mok Gyeongun lightly dodged it, Eunuch Ho couldn't help but be inwardly surprised. This bastard is no ordinary person. It was a single thrust he had made with the intention of quickly subduing him, as it was in the presence of His Highness Prince Gyeongjin. It was difficult to ascertain his level based on his energy, which was barely detectable, but with this one move, it became clear. He's a master on par with me. If he was such a supreme master, he could assess the opponent's skill with just a single move. Eunuch Ho slightly bent and then straightened the wrist holding the soft sword. The soft sword wriggled like a living snake and aimed at Mok Jae-eun in a peculiar direction. Swish. However, Mok Jae-eun dodged the trajectory of the soft sword by simply taking half a step back. As if he had anticipated that he would dodge it, Eunuch Ho shouted. "Look here. An enemy has infiltrated." It was a cry infused with inner force. Outside, there were embroidered uniform guards and eunuchs from the Western Depot. Calling for their help was not to repel this person but to evacuate His Highness. However, an enemy has infiltrated. An enemy has infiltrated. An enemy has infiltrated. At that moment, Eunuch Ho's voice resonated in the room like an echo. It wasn't just a voice but one infused with inner force, so it was so resounding that Prince Jaeongjin frowned and hastily covered his ears. Ugh. Damn it. Eunuch Ho's complexion darkened. The echo in this confined space was because the shout had bounced off and rebounded. Through this, Eunuch Ho could tell. He has surrounded the entire room with true energy. Even a master at the pinnacle stage of Transcendent Realm could cover a certain space with their true energy to block sound. Naturally, a master of this caliber wouldn't be unable to do so. Tap tap tap. Eunuch Ho displayed a peculiar footwork with quick, tottering movements, distancing himself from Mok Jae-eun, and then stood in front of Prince Jaeongjin. It was to protect him. Eunuch Ho sent a secret message to convey his thoughts. Your Highness, this person is no ordinary master. Even I won't be able to subdue him easily, so if an opportunity arises, you must leave this place, even if it means breaking the window. At his words, a glint flashed in Prince Jaeongjin's eyes. As the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho was a master of martial arts whose match was hard to find throughout the entire palace. This was the first time he had seen him show such vigilance. That meant the unknown person wearing Eunuch Biam's face was a dangerous individual and an outstanding master, right? Then, Prince Jaeongjin spoke to Mok Jae-eun, who was wearing Eunuch Biam's face. Hey, who sent you here? Your Highness. Seeing his behavior, Chief Eunuch Ho inwardly clicked his tongue. It was no different from an assassin infiltrating the palace. Yet in this situation his master whom he served had the audacity to talk to such a person. He was truly bold. But there was no way such a person would obediently answer His Highness's question. Well, who could have sent me? Eunuch Ho frowned and looked at Mok Jae-eun. What the hell was he? If he had come to assassinate His Highness, there was no way he would answer such a question one by one. As he was puzzled, Prince Jaeongjin spoke calmly. For a master like you, whom even Eunuch Ho here is wary of, there are only 3 people who come to mind who could send you. They were the powerful figures of the palace, excluding himself. He thought it would be one of the 3. Hang Yoon, the Grand Preceptor who also served as the Admiral of the Central Navy, the Prince Jong, the Emperor's second prince, or Imperial Noble Consort Seo. Seeing that they even had you imitate the face of Eunuch Biam, who can be considered my close aide, they seem to have made up their mind. This was an excellent move even in his own opinion. If it was said that he had died at the hands of Eunuch Biam, it would ultimately be concluded as an internal conflict. Although the embroidered uniform guards would investigate whether it was someone's instigation, it could be easily ended by eliminating the real Eunuch Biam. Prince Jaeongjin clicked his tongue and said, You must have killed Eunuch Biam, right? For a noble person you're quite smart. Thank you for the compliment. At his calm tone, Mok Jae-eun was inwardly intrigued. Although it was amusing to see him misunderstand and speculate based on partial circumstances, he was indeed different from ordinary people, befitting a clan that ruled a country. It could be seen from how he tried to calmly unravel the situation while being tense. Mok Jae-eun smiled and said, Then you must know that further conversation is meaningless. With those words, Mok Jae-eun clenched his sword fingers. Sharp sword energy flowed out, and the air became heavy with murderous intent. It was to the extent that even Prince Jaeongjin, who had not learned martial arts, could feel it. It's suffocating. Faced with Mok Jae-eun's sharp aura, Eunuch Ho gripped his soft sword and assumed a fighting stance. Your Highness, while I hold off this person you must leave no matter what. Chief Eunuch Ho, who repeated those words once more, tried to launch himself toward Mok Jae-eun. Right then Prince Jaeongjin stopped him. Hold it. At his command, Eunuch Ho couldn't hide his troubled expression. If he were to release his fighting stance first in this situation, it would become difficult to protect Prince Jaeongjin. Nevertheless, Prince Jaeongjin persisted. Your Highness, that must not be done. This person is truly dangerous. It's fine, so stop. Your Highness. Didn't I say it's fine? I trust you. And if today is my last day, it would be my fate to go even if you don't stop him. At Prince Gyeongjin's words, Chief Eunuch Ho bit his lip and released his fighting stance. Since the opponent was a master who couldn't be let down his guard against, he didn't want to easily release his vigilance, but he couldn't disobey His Highness's order. Seeing this, Mok Jae-eun spoke with puzzlement. Doesn't seem like a good choice. At those words, Prince Gyeongjin clasped his hands together and showed courtesy toward Mok Jae-eun. Mok Jae-eun's eyes flickered at the sight. What kind of behavior was this all of a sudden? As he wondered, Prince Gyeongjin bowed his head and spoke. I am a person who values talent and respects the strong who deserve to be treated well. You respect the strong? That's right. I need many heroes like you for what I want to do. Ah. At Prince Gyeongjin's words, the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, was troubled. His Highness's strong point, or rather his bad habit, had emerged. If there was a desirable talent, regardless of whether they were an enemy or an obstacle, he would first reach out to them. This could be used in a good way, but there were also cases where it wasn't. Especially if they were an enemy targeting his life. At that moment, Mok Jae-eun spoke. You're quite a unique person. At his tone, which sounded intrigued, Prince Gyeongjin couldn't help but feel inwardly relieved. If he were someone who showed no reaction at all despite his utmost courtesy, there would be no room for negotiation. However, showing such a reaction meant that he was someone who could be persuaded. I may be unique or foolish, but I have a great desire for talented individuals. It seems that way. Since the situation is like this, I'll be straightforward. I don't know whose request or order you received, but using an excellent talent like you for such a dirty job like assassination is no different from misusing resources. Misusing resources. It meant using the resources of one state in another state, implying that they were being used in a place where their true value was not recognized. So, with a heart that earnestly desires talent, I want to invite you to become my person. I don't know what compensation you receive from them, but I am willing to treat you even better, so please become a pillar of support for me. Pillar of support. It referred to a person who could be entrusted with important tasks of a household or a country, meaning someone who could handle the most critical matters. Prince Gyeongjin's persuasive abilities and eloquence were close to being unrivaled. With his profound learning, he had made numerous talents his own people through such eloquence. It is said that people bow their heads to those who recognize their worth. I don't know whose person he is, but no one will be able to treat him as well as I can. Whether it was Imperial Noble Consort Seo, who only had her body as a weapon, the arrogant and unmatched influential official Hang Yoon, or the cruel second prince, who believed his position had been stolen. Which one of them could match his magnanimity? Tremble, tremble. At that moment, Mok Jae-eun lowered his head, covered his mouth with his palm and slightly shook his face. It seemed as if he was emotionally overwhelmed. Seeing this, the corners of Prince Gyeongjin's mouth slightly rose. It appeared that this gamble, born from his desire for talent, had paid off. Prince Gyeongjin approached Mok Jae-eun. Your Highness. Prince Gyeongjin shook his head. It's all right. This person has understood my intention. With those words, Prince Gyeongjin approached Mok Jae-eun again and placed his hand on his right shoulder, laughing heartily. Haha. Seems that I have virtue. To gain such an outstanding warrior with the capacity of a fortress. Suddenly, Prince Gyeongjin couldn't finish his sentence. That's because Mok Jae-eun's face as he lifted his head was closer to boredom, as if he was forcibly holding back a yawn, rather than being overwhelmed by his eloquence. I apologize. It seemed too obvious that I was trying to hold back a yawn, as it's not polite to yawn while you're delivering an impassioned speech. At those words, Prince Gyeongjin was dumbfounded. He had shown such courtesy and praised him, yet the only reaction he showed was holding back a yawn? This was equivalent to insulting him, a royal and a prince. Prince Gyeongjin was inwardly very displeased, but since he was too close to Mok Jae-eun, he suppressed it and spoke in a gentle voice. Perhaps my words were too long. Then let me put it simply. Please become my person. With those words, he clasped his hands together and bowed his head once more, showing courtesy. As a prince, he had lowered himself to this extent and praised him. If he had done this much, even this bastard should show sufficient sincerity. Stab. At that moment, something sharp pierced Prince Gyeongjin's left eyeball. Rather than the pain from the needle that suddenly pierced his eye, Prince Gyeongjin was startled and tried to push Mok Jae-eun away. Grab. However, Mok Jae-eun grabbed his wrist, making it impossible to push him away. You bastard. Seeing this scene, the enraged chief eunuch Ho hurriedly tried to save Prince Gyeongjin. However, if you don't want to see His Highness die, it's best to stay still. You scoundrel. Chief eunuch Ho hesitated on the spot. He gritted his teeth. Even if His Highness had said it was all right, he should have somehow prevented him from getting close. Meanwhile, Prince Gyeongjin, who was squinting his left eye, spoke to Mok Jae-eun in an incomprehensible tone. Why are you doing this? I even showed courtesy and said I would treat you even better. You're asking why I suddenly did that? Yes. Because you talk too much.